All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Shefali Ramakrishna, and today I'll be talking about speeding up Gonality computation. So some of you guys might be wondering, okay, I don't know what any of these words mean, please help. So in order to do that, I'm just going to give a brief overview about what all we'll be talking about today. So we're going to begin with giving a little bit of background so we understand what exactly gonality is. And in order to do that, we need to understand a few definitions, one of those being chip firing games, a game played on a graph. Then we're going to talk a little bit about why we even need a computational tool for this, then get into the meat of the talk, our algorithm. We're going to briefly discuss the original algorithm in place and then discuss each of the separate speedups we implemented. And finally, we'll end with where we go from here and discuss some potential future speedups for the algorithm. So let's begin, like I said, about talking about chip firing games. In order to do that, we're going to discuss some definitions first. So a divisor is a placement of chips on a graph. These chips are essentially integer values assigned to vertices. So you can have a graph, basically you can have a negative number of chips on a vertex, a positive number of chips on a vertex, 0 chips on a vertex. The total number of chips present in a divisor, so the sum of all the chips on all the vertices in a graph, that's called the degree of a divisor. So in a chip firing game, a player is going to move between different divisors via a series of what are called chip firing moves. So essentially what happens in a chip firing move is you select a vertex or a set of vertices, and then along each edge connected to that vertex or set of vertices, you send one chip to the neighbor. So let's look at an example of this on the 3 cycle, C3. We have a divisor here with 2 chips on the top vertex, 0 chips on the bottom 2 vertices. As you can tell, this is a divisor of degree 2. There are 2 total chips. So let's say we want to fire the top vertex of this graph. What we're going to do is send 1 chip along each edge as follows. And so now we're going to have 0 chips on the top vertex and 1 chip on each of the bottom 2 vertices. So now let's get into the definition we really care about for this talk. But one thing we'll note here is that 2 divisors are said to be equivalent if you can get from one to the other via a series of chip firing moves. And one quick note I want to make here is that this relationship is actually an equivalence relation. It satisfies the 3 properties of symmetry, reflexivity, and transitivity. So now let's talk about what the actual process of playing a chip firing game looks like. It's a game played with 2 players in a given graph. So these 2 players, A and B, are given a graph. And player A is going to place K chips. K is going to be set here on various vertices of the graph. What player B is going to do is place a -1 chip on some vertex. Player B will want to place a -1 chip on a vertex with 0 chips on it, so that there's a negative value on a negative number of chips on that vertex. Now, player A is going to attempt to remove the debt from that vertex via a series of chip firing moves. So when we say player A is going to want to remove the debt, they're going to want to fire vertices in such a way that they don't introduce new debt on any vertices, and so that they can send at least 1 chip to the vertex that has a -1 chip on it, so that there are only positive or non-negative numbers of chips on each of the vertices. So I jumped the gun a little bit last time, but here's where we get into the definition we really care about, the gonality of our graph. So the gonality of a graph, it's a graph invariant, and it's the minimum degree of a divisor that can eliminate 1 debt placed anywhere on the graph. So that means no matter where player B places a -1 chip, player A can use a series of chip firing moves to send 1 chip to that vertex so that, and doesn't introduce debt anywhere else, so that there are only non-negative chip values on the graph. So I realize I gave you guys a lot of definitions and stuff without really giving any examples. So this might be a little nebulous right now. So let's just look at our handy old C3 graph again. Again, we have the divisor we were looking at before of degree 2. So here the divisor, let's say we're indexing the vertices in a certain way. So our divisor is 2, 0, 0. Our degree is 2. And I'm going to tell you that the gonality of this graph is in fact 2. So we need to show 2 things in order to prove that the gonality of our graph is equal to a certain number. First, we need to show, in this case, that there exists a divisor of degree 2 that can eliminate debt no matter where debt is placed on the graph. And then we need to show that there does not exist a divisor of degree 1 that can eliminate debt no matter where debt is placed. So in order to show our gonality of this graph is 2, let's begin with the first step. Let's look at this divisor here and place a -1 chip on the bottom left vertex to see if we can eliminate debt. Some of you guys may be thinking, rightfully so, that, well, if we fire the top vertex and send 1 chip along each edge, we eliminate debt. There are no negative placements of chips left, so we're good. Now we want to see if we can eliminate debt with a divisor of only degree 1. Well, let's say we place a -1 chip on the bottom left. Oh, and one quick note, sorry, about this is that we know we can eliminate debt placed anywhere by symmetry. If we place the -1 on the right vertex, we do the same move and we eliminate debt. So like I said, let's look at a vertex of a divisor of degree 1 and see if we can eliminate debt placed anywhere. Let's say we have -1 on the bottom left vertex again, and let's say, okay, we want to see what we can do. We fire the top vertex. We send 1 chip along each edge, and what happens is that we actually ended up introducing debt. While we did eliminate debt on the bottom left vertex, we've introduced debt. So we see this is not at all a proof that gonality is equal to 1. Gonality is equal to 2, but it does illustrate for us why it's tricky it's actually not possible, in fact, to eliminate debt, to eliminate 1 debt with a divisor of degree 1. So some of you guys may be thinking, okay, great, you showed this, it seems to be a pretty simple process. Why would anyone need a computational tool for that? Which is where I would follow up by asking if anyone can prove to me, tell me what the gonality of this graph is and prove that to me. This is the 5 cube. It's a graph with 32 vertices. So some of you here might be able to find a placement of 16 chips that can eliminate debt placed anywhere, and that's great. But then the second part of proving gonality is 16 would be lower bounding it, proving that there doesn't exist a divisor of degree 15 that can eliminate debt no matter where it's placed. And that's where our computational tool comes in. It's able to look through all divisors of degree 15 and show that none of them can eliminate debt no matter where it's placed. So we find, actually using our tool, that the gonality of Q5, the 5 cube, is equal to 16. So some of you guys might be thinking, oh shoot, computing gonality is hard, and it is, it's pretty difficult. Luckily, we can determine whether or not a divisor can eliminate debt using this algorithm called Thur's burning algorithm. What essentially it does is you take a divisor and you select a vertex, and Thur's tries to tell you which chip firing moves to use so that you send as many chips as possible onto that vertex. And luckily, this algorithm actually runs in polynomial time, which is awesome. So I'm not going to go into details about the algorithm because that would eat up a lot of time, but we're going to black box it for now. Essentially, it takes in a divisor, tells us whether or not it can eliminate debt on a specific vertex. And if it can eliminate debt on a specific vertex, it tells us how to do so. So the thing is, for a given degree d on a graph with n vertices, the total number of divisors to check is about n to the d. It's a lot of vertices. And as it turns out, while running Thurs can be done in polynomial time, computing graph gonality is actually NP hard. This was proven back in 2020. So that's why our algorithm is important. We want to design and implement heuristics to cut down on the time and memory cost of computing gonality. So now let's talk about the algorithm. Essentially, what this algorithm does is it takes in an input of a graph G and a degree D. And then it outputs whether or not there exists a divisor of this degree that can eliminate 1 debt no matter where it's placed on our graph. And if such a divisor exists, it will output the first divisor it finds that does so. So if such a divisor exists, then the gonality of our graph is less than or equal to the degree we're checking. And if the divisor doesn't exist, then the gonality of our graph is strictly greater than the degree we're checking. So now let's just look over our initial algorithm so we understand what's happening. It takes in the same input and output I outlined before, and it begins by generating a list of all possible divisors of degree D on graph G. This is a big list, and generating this list takes time. Then for each divisor in this list, and for each vertex on our graph, we are going to place a -1 chip on that vertex and run Thurs to determine if that debt can be eliminated. If it can't be eliminated, we're not going to check any more of the vertices. We're just going to skip to the next vertex, to the next divisor, and check if debt can be eliminated on every vertex. But if debt can be eliminated on this vertex, we're going to move on to the next vertex and check if debt can be eliminated with this divisor on that vertex. And if we find that, det can be eliminated on all the vertices for this specific vertex, for this specific divisor, excuse me, we're going to terminate our algorithm and output this divisor. And if we find that we've gone through the whole list, there are no divisors left to check, then we're going to terminate and we see that gonality is going to be strictly greater than our degree. So we're going to use two main techniques to save memory and time of this algorithm. A lexicographic ordering of divisors, which is memory and time saving, and then the second thing we're going to use is using something called partial orientations on graphs to reduce the number of divisors we need to check, which is time saving. So with lexicographic ordering, basically, we're going to generate each divisor based on the last divisor, as if it's in alphabetical order. So for a quick example, let's say if you have a divisor of degree 3 on a graph G with 4 vertices. The first divisor, 3, 0, 0, 0, can be thought of as AAAA in the dictionary. Second divisor, 2, 1, 0, 0 is AAAB, let's say. And the cool thing about this is that we can actually generate each divisor based on the last. We have an algorithm to do that. We go on until our last divisor lexicographically would be 0, 0, 0, 3, all the chips on the last indexed vertex. The indexing is kind of arbitrary. Obviously it needs to stay the same, but what we make the first vertex isn't specified. So this way we only have to store one divisor at a time. We sort of generate a divisor, check the divisor, generate next divisor, check a divisor, instead of storing all divisors of degree D on n vertices. So this allows us to compute the gonality of graphs subject only to the runtime of the algorithm, not to the device memory, unless you, for some reason, chose to try to compute the gonality of a graph where the number of vertices actually just max out the memory of your computer, in which case I ask why you were doing that. But let's quickly look at how this changes our algorithm. It changes it in 3 places, basically all related to how we're generating our divisors. In the beginning, instead of generating this huge list taking up a bunch of time, we just generate our first divisor by placing all our chips on the first vertex. Second, when we're trying to go to the next divisor, instead of going down in the list, we just generate a new divisor based on the last. And finally, one of our termination conditions, instead of checking if we run out of divisors in the list, we just check if the last divisor has all its chips on the last vertex and terminate in that case. Now we want to talk about how we are reducing the number of divisors to check. This follows work by Spencer Backman in 2014 on partial orientations on graphs. And we get the following theorem. Given a graph D, any divisor D of degree less than or equal to the number of edges minus the number of vertices is going to be equivalent to another divisor, D prime, such that the number of chips on each vertex is less than or equal to the valence of that vertex minus 1. And if the number of chips on a vertex is equal to the valence of that vertex minus 1, and the number of chips on another vertex is equal to the valence of that vertex minus 1, then there's not going to be an edge connecting those two vertices. They aren't going to be adjacent. So as a quick note here, the valence of a vertex is the number of edges connected to that vertex. So let's look at how this eliminates divisors to check. As you can see, this is an example of the theorem. Basically, on the left, we have a divisor of degree 4 on the complete graph with 5 vertices. And we can see this doesn't meet condition 1 of the last theorem. The number of chips on the vertex is equal to the valence. But if we chip fire the top vertex, we see that it's equivalent to another divisor that for which both conditions in the theorem do hold true. And one quick note, it won't be one chip firing move necessarily by which these things are equivalent, but what this tells us is that there exists somewhere a divisor that is equivalent that satisfies both conditions. So what this tells us is that we don't need to check divisors in which any vertex has valence or more chips, and we don't need to check divisors in which adjacent vertices both have at least valence minus 1 chips. We simply skip past any of these divisors that meet either of these above conditions. So this changes our algorithm just by adding a line in our divisor generator section. While the next divisor we've generated doesn't meet the valence rules in the theorem, we generate the next divisor. We don't check it, we just skip it and run past it. Finally, there was a speed up we implemented for vertex transitive graphs in which we're only checking divisors where the most chips are present on the first vertex. This drastically reduces the number of divisors we need to check for vertex transitive graphs, as you may imagine, and includes all previous speedups we had implemented. So basically, for a vertex transitive graph with n vertices and t total divisors to initially check, we now only need to check t over n divisors. It reduces the number of vertices we need to check by a factor of n. Now let's finish up by talking about where we go from here, because there's still work we can do. These potential further speedups would be implemented in the divisor checking section of the algorithm, the area where we're running Thar's algorithm. They basically have to do with reducing the number of vertices to check, because as we're trying to determine if debt can be eliminated on a specific vertex, we're going to be using chip firing moves. So we want to see if we send chips to vertices in that process, we don't need to check that we can send chips to them specifically another time, because we already know we can. The other speedup we want to implement is running Thar's algorithm for the different stopping condition. Essentially, normally what we're doing is we're trying to send as many chips as possible onto the specific vertex we're trying to check. But in the end, what we actually want to check is that we can just send at least one chip to the vertex we care about. Finally, the last speed up we think we want to implement, and I'm sure there are more, is skipping a divisor if we know it's equivalent to a divisor checked before. Again, that'll be in analyzing how we're using chip firing moves to eliminate debt. So thanks so much for listening to the talk, and I wanted to give a quick thank you to my fellow research members, our advisor, Ralph Morrison, for all of the help he's provided this summer, and finally to the Small RU program in Williams College for giving me and my research members the opportunity to do this work. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pause recording, and then people can be free